A couple of weeks ago, we talked about monitoring your emotional currency or energy and the impact that relationships can have on the deposits and withdrawals that are made in your life. Now, one way that we can keep track of the comings and goings of our emotional currency is through setting boundaries in those relationships. It's important that we both create or set boundaries and maintain boundaries in our lives. And so today, let's break down how we can create and maintain boundaries in our relationships. Now, I've always wanted to do something a little different, like talk about mental health while I also do things like my makeup. And so we're going to give that a try today. So if you're interested, just keep watching. Now that we're all zoomed in, hi there. My name is Dr. Erika, and on this channel, we encourage radical change to inspire far-reaching impact. Let's start with a little primer before we dive right into it. Let me grab my mirror. So setting healthy boundaries is going to be rooted in establishing limits and space, and even an understanding between you and another person or entity, like your job. It's a clear place and establishes a clear place where you begin and another person or thing ends. And that's super important so that there can be some separation to acknowledge the difference and variation between the two. So the purpose of creating and maintaining healthy boundaries is to protect yourself, in all honesty. It's a way of taking care of yourself and maintaining some stability. Creating and maintaining healthy boundaries also can help to establish and strengthen one's identity. So I'm just going to get my foundation on. And so I wonder about one's kind of like experience or history with creating boundaries. I know I, for one, learned about boundaries much later in life, and as a result of kind of feeling like I was pulled in a number of different directions. So when we think about boundaries, boundaries can actually be both physical or emotional, or more like psychological. If we think about some physical boundaries, that can actually be barriers that we put up or that are set up and established. So if we think about kind of boundaries that exist in places like fences, or when we put and establish physical boundaries by like putting our hands out, our arms out to stop or keep someone from doing something. And then emotional or psychological boundaries, or things that we cannot see, but that are still important for establishing and putting up so that we can maintain a sense of safety. Right? Just blend this out. So today I figured we could talk a little bit about both establishing or creating boundaries and maintaining them, because both are really important. Sometimes we tend to set boundaries or establish boundaries and then we don't follow up, and that can get us into trouble for sure. And so both creating and establishing and maintaining boundaries are super important. So to create boundaries, the first thing that we have to do is actually examine our current boundaries. So taking some inventory or assessment of where our boundaries currently stand in different areas of our life. It may be easier for us to identify boundaries in workplace or in our relationships, or friendships, or even our romantic partnerships. But you want to start by kind of taking a look at the current boundary structures that you have with the people and things in your life. So, for example, you might have great boundaries with friends and family. You are able to, protect your time, protect your peace, energy, finance. You don't have any problem saying no or directing people to where they can get the level of support that they need, especially if you cannot provide it or are unwilling to provide it. You don't have trouble not lending your cousin money or any of those things. You've been able to establish some form of boundaries in those relationships. However, you struggle with maintaining boundaries or establishing boundaries in romantic partnerships, especially new relationships that you are hoping or want to work out. I think we're going to need a little more coverage here. So you notice that kind of your boundaries and ability to maintain boundaries is lacking when it comes to romantic partnerships. And so this would be the area that you might say or establish kind of needs to be targeted when it comes to shoring up some of those boundaries. I'm just going to blend that out. So one thing to think about is if you get easily irritated or angry or frustrated when it comes to certain interactions, that usually is going to be a clear sign that there is a need to kind of look at the boundaries that are currently in place. Because those feelings that we are reacting to are directly related to kind of some push that's happening in that relationship that hasn't been addressed. All right. I think today I'm going to try to have eyebrows. We'll see. We'll see how that goes. All right. So after you examine those relationships and take a look at what your current boundary structure or boundaries look like, you then want to actually determine what boundaries you need to have in those areas where they are lacking. And so again, if we're using the example of, let's say, the romantic relationship, then we might take a look and say, you know what? I might want to have a better sense of established boundary with my time. I realize that, especially when I'm in a new relationship, we might text all day, even though I'm at work, or when I get home, we talk all day, or talk all night rather, and talk until 12 o'clock in the morning, even though I know that I've got to get up for my job at 3 a.m. Unacceptable. And so there needs to be some type of boundary established in that relationship so that you make sure that you draw a clear line between you, your needs, and the other person, this other relationship. So if you definitely draw this line and determine kind of what the boundary needs are, you really want to focus, especially when you're communicating the boundary that you're establishing, you want to make sure that you focus on your needs and not the other person. And that's to help make sure that the other person will also do the same. They're going to be focused on where you're directing their attention. So for example, let's say again, we're talking about this romantic relationship and the issue is, the person wants to go out on the weeknight as you all are kind of dating and getting to know each other. And you might feel, or might even say to the person, like, you never consider me anytime that you're planning a date, you don't consider my feelings or my work schedule, my job. And, I'm going to need you to start doing that. Like, I don't have time to go out on the weekends. I don't have time to go out on the weekdays. And you always try to plan something or ask that we spend time on the weekdays. And you need to stop doing that. You need to take into account my feeling, my need. Okay. So you could say that, but now the person is going to be focused on, them. You've made it about them and what they may need to do. And of course, they're going to kind of take a look and see if that is in line with what they need to do. They're not going to necessarily hear that you want something from them that is focused on yourself and you. And so you might need to say, no, I'm not going to be able to go out on the weekday on a Thursday because when I come in from work, I really need that time to myself. I need time to recharge, time to re-energize and focus. And I'd much rather go out on the weekends. I would not like to go out during the week. And so how does Saturday work for you? Right? So what you're saying is, I have this need. I'm establishing this need with you. And now you have the opportunity to kind of hear what I need and determine whether or not you are able or willing to meet that need. And so it's important that we remember that we don't have to justify or apologize for setting our boundary, because it's just that. That would be like me trying to justify or apologizing needing water and food. I'm a human. And so those are things that I need. And so just like, my boundaries, I have determined, learned, understand about myself that this is important for me to have in place to thrive and survive. And so I would appreciate if you respect and honor that. And that's all we're asking. And so you don't have to justify it. You don't have to provide any explanation. It's not required. And really, we also don't want to, or, don't need to get angry if the person has difficulty following that, because that is less about us and the fact that we have set the boundary, and it's more about them. So one thing that we have to keep in mind is that we don't have any control over whether or not someone honors and respects the boundary that we are attempting to put in place with them. All we can do is set it and be very clear and respectful about what we're saying and how we are getting our needs and our point across. And it's up to the other person to be able to be in a position to be able to do the same. Now, because we have absolutely no control over whether or not someone follows, maintains, or respects our boundary, it's really important for us to then establish some consequences that will help uphold those boundaries. So again, no one has any obligation to follow our boundary, but what we then have the right to do is say, here's the level of access that you then can have towards me or with me if you're not able to essentially follow along. Here I'm trying a new little concealer hack. We'll see how it goes. No promises here. All right. So I feel like sometimes people get a little funny when folks start throwing around words like consequences. And all consequences are the result or the outcome of a thing. And so that means consequences can really be both positive and negative. And I think that's important to keep in mind that, I think when people hear consequences, they just think negative, but they can also really be positive. And so with that, a positive outcome of maintaining and holding a boundary could very well be that the person is able to hear you and respect your position and follow it, and everybody's happy. They have learned what you need and what you need from them to be able to be a part of a healthy and happy, productive situation, and you have your needs met, right? And so that is a positive outcome, a positive consequence of being able to hold and maintain that hold on that boundary. A negative consequence, or outcome of holding a boundary is that the person might get frustrated, or they may lose access to you because of their inability to follow the guidelines or directive that you have outlined for them. And that is, negative for them. But it doesn't necessarily mean that we shouldn't then look to hold boundaries just because there may be some negative outcome. It may be best that if that person is saying, I cannot follow, respect, appreciate the boundaries and limitations that you're setting in this relationship, that's probably not a relationship that we want to hold and uphold and provide space for. So we definitely don't want to let things like fear of rejection or abandonment and or confrontation keep us from setting boundaries. We very well may be suffering and may be the person that kind of has some negative consequence based on our not setting a boundary and not establishing our limitations to others by virtue of trying to protect them. And that's not something we want to do for sure. We also want to be mindful of rejecting those feelings of guilt that may come up as we look to establish boundaries. Sometimes, just like with other forms of self-care and really valuing ourselves, we can feel guilty for putting those things in place, but that's something that we don't need to feel guilty for. We don't need to feel guilty for taking care of ourselves or for saying to someone else, this is how you best take care of me. And so we have to be very mindful of when those feelings come up, especially if we recognize that we may not have grown up with the understanding that setting healthy boundaries is okay and it's a must for us to, again, survive and thrive. All right. Now, in order for us to maintain boundaries after we've established them and set them and make sure everyone knows what the deal is, we need to brace ourselves for impact. So anytime that we introduce or share something that may be new, not only for us, but for other people, it can get a little rocky. So our first time setting boundaries, we might notice that the person that we are setting boundaries with or the agency that we're setting boundaries with may have some type of reaction, especially if they don't understand. We're bound to get pushback. So given that we can expect pushback, one of the things that I definitely want to remind us of is we are not responsible for someone else's reaction to our boundary setting. We can't control it, but we can definitely expect it and prepare for it. And with that, we can kind of determine what we're going to do about their reaction and responses, like those consequences we talked about. Again, your only job or role is to communicate your needs and do it in a way that is respectful of the person so that they can really hear you and you take out any of those barriers that sometimes exist, like yelling or, being, I don't want to say disrespectful, but kind of doing it in a way where it may close off someone to being able to hear you and receive what you're saying. All right, next, we want to make sure that we are prepared for the test. So in order for there to be a testimony about maintaining boundaries, we have to recognize that people will test our boundaries. People who have a history of controlling or manipulating and or abusing you or other people are always going to put your boundaries to the test. They're going to see whether or not you're serious or to see what they might get away with. And so while you may not always break your boundaries that you've set, you might have a history of having bent boundaries, or they've may notice that in the past with other people, they've been able to have them bend those boundaries. And so folks are going to test those things. So this may look like if you have set a standard or an expectation or boundary in all new relationships, like you expect for others to, be able to invest in you before you begin investing in them, or in the way that they may be asking you to, for you to feel valued in the relationship, or you'd like to establish some connection in other ways before they start to make demands on your time and energy, then that is something that you are going to be clear about from the start. So when someone goes to make that demand, you might say, oh, that's not something that I'm in a position to do right now, especially maybe given where we are in our relationship, right? That needs no explanation. We might need to develop more of a relationship before I feel comfortable doing that. And that is okay. It's okay for me to say that. So you just want to make sure that you remain firm, because setting a clear, healthy boundary can easily be misunderstood, especially if we do things like apologize for having to set the boundary, or we bend and say, you know what, this one good time, I'm willing to do that. People get the wrong message about whether or not we are going to be good at maintaining and upholding our boundaries. All right. And one of the last things that we want to consider when we think about maintaining healthy boundaries is the fact that this is a muscle, and it's a muscle that we really are going to have to work over time. So it's important that you recognize your willingness to honor others' boundaries as a way of really being able to strengthen your own. So how good are you with when others say, this is my boundary? How good are you with respecting the boundary that they have set? And this can really give you a good idea of whether or not you will be good at, again, maintaining or respecting others. And this one, I'm going to continue to reiterate. We want to push past those feelings of guilt or selfishness or even embarrassment around setting boundaries. We want to do that anyway. It's important that you remind yourself that it is your right. What was that? It is important that you remind yourself that it is perfectly okay for you to put limits on yourself, because you yourself have limits. And so there's absolutely nothing wrong with doing that. And just like any muscle, the more that you work it over time, the better that you will get around kind of using it, the stronger that it will get, and the more confident you will feel when you are asked to kind of establish new boundaries. Because that's the other piece, is that this isn't going to be the first or last time or first relationship situation that you're going to have to establish boundaries for yourself. And like any muscle, you are going to want to and have to work it and continue to work at it for the rest of your life. And the last thing that I'll emphasize is making sure that you get you a crew. So anytime we are trying to grow and develop and establish a new way of being, it can be really important for us to have folks around us that help remind us why we need to set those boundaries in the first place, and remind us through the fact that they can be respected and they can be honored. So people who respect and value the fact that you have established these boundaries and set them, and they respect them by following them. And so making sure that you keep the majority of people around you who are able to maintain and respect the boundaries that you've put in place is super helpful for you to be able to say, hey, if you're not able to do this, it's not a relationship that I may need to continue or really devote a lot of energy to or even maintain, because I've got other people who have proved that I'm not asking for too much and are able to do that with no problem for me as I am for them. All right, here's the final look. And hopefully today we've been able to learn a little bit about how to set and maintain boundaries. If you have enjoyed this content and would like to see more about how psychology can walk and talk and show up in your everyday life, Feel free to subscribe, drop us a comment, or send us a message, and we'll see you soon.